and welcome to our Constitutional Chats podcast. Please tell us a little bit about Article 2 and executive orders, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Great. And thank you for having me again. I think, one of the things that I love about this organization is that you're reaching out to the youth of America and talking about things in a way that, sometimes they seem nerdy, but I want to give you context of how these things affect your daily life. And today I'm talking about executive orders. One of the things that I realized about executive orders is that when I was maybe taking civics in high school, or even when I was studying political science in college, I don't really remember them being mentioned. Maybe they were mentioned in passing, but there's no sort of clarification of what they were or what they did. And the reality is, and what I do now as a lawyer, particularly practicing constitutional law as well as what we call administrative law, and that's the law of the executive branch, so law of regulation. I spend a lot of time thinking about how statutes are implemented, whether that is through regulation or executive orders. And the thing that I've come to find since going to law school and starting to practice in this area is that executive orders, whether or not we're aware of them, affect our daily lives. And I use an example of sort of what has happened over the past 2 years with COVID, in that the way a lot of the government was responding in an emergency posture was through executive order, executive action, until Congress could say, get together and pass bills to pass financial reliefs or other sort of statutes that helped ease America through what was a difficult and sort of untested time. So that's one example of how they affect people's lives. Putting executive orders into context, obviously, as we're marching our way towards Constitution Day, as you're aware, there's 3 branches of government: Congress, who makes the laws, that's Article 1. The executive branch, who implements and enforces those laws, that's Article 2. And obviously, finally, the courts, which are Article 3. And, courts, their job is really to sort of say what the law is. I like to think about them in like a baseball context, right? They're an umpire, they're calling balls and strikes. And if there's a discrepancy about whether something is a ball or a strike, then maybe they go to the rule book and they say, okay, well, we think the rule is this. And in that way, we separate the powers between the various branches, and that sort of decentralized power means that, both collaborative government and government that butts up against each other, and helps protect all of our rights, all of our interests, by making sure that things aren't too centralized. And so when we think about executive orders, the first thing we wonder is, well, where do they come from? What is their source of law? And there's no particular aspect of Article 2 that says, and from time to time, the president may issue executive orders. There's no language like that. What Article 2 says to the president in terms of setting out his powers, obviously, the president has executive power, and it's his job or her job to make sure that the laws are faithfully executed. And that's the sort of constitutional power that we're talking about when we're talking about under what authority can a president issue an executive order. The other way presidents can issue executive orders if they're empowered by Congress, and that's when Congress passes a statute or a law, and they delegate or give some of their power, their legislative power, to the president, and permit the president to then go out and do what's necessary. So that's the other sort of source of law. So sometimes what you'll see is, especially in the more modern, more recent executive orders, is it will say, for example, President Biden issues this executive order pursuant to, and it'll cite some statutes. That's sort of how courts, if an executive order is challenged, can go back and say, well, is this what the statute really says? Does the president really have the power to do what's in this executive order? So that's how all the parts work together, the 3 branches, and sort of permitting executive orders either to be issued or to rescind them in some way. And so there's been a ton of executive orders over time. I think I've seen anywhere between 13,000 and 15,000 as the number of executive orders that have been issued over time. And I know some of you might be saying, well, how do we not know? Part of that is we weren't really numbering executive orders as a country until about 1905, 1907. When somebody had a good idea that if we're issuing all these documents, maybe we should be able to track them down in the future. And then in 1935, under the Federal Register Act, they started actually numbering executive orders. So what you see now is, for example, if President Biden were to issue an executive order tomorrow, it would be executive order, and then they would give it the next number in ascending order as the one after it. So a good way to think about this is the higher the number you see, the more recent the executive order is. And so that's one of the ways that we can look at them. And, you know, the Federal Register Act is kind of an interesting thing. If we think about where the country started, right after the Revolution, right after the Constitution was adopted, our federal government was fairly small, fairly spread out. But by, say, the early 1900s, 1930s, certainly post-World War II, the size of the federal government expanded massively. And part of that is just a product of sequential world wars, government intervention in economics during the Great Depression, development of things we now know today as, you know, Social Security, the social welfare programs. And so you need people and organizations and agencies that go and make sure all of this is getting done. All of those are housed in the executive branch under the president. And what executive orders effectively do is they provide a mechanism for the president to manage the orders of the day, manage the administration. And in that way, it's sometimes good as an analogy to think of the president like the CEO of a company, right? He's got all of these organizations spread out amongst the 50 states and our territories. And in the case of some of our military operations operating in other countries, we have millions of federal workers and active servicemen and women. And the president is in charge of all of that. I mean, that's a lot to sort of get your hands around. And so executive orders are a way for the president to signal to the people who work underneath him in the executive branch and to the agencies, this is how I would like to do business. This is how I would like to order our affairs, to administer our law. That's why it's called the administration. And some of that is actually derived from George Washington's first executive order. And this is the first one on the books that was ever written. It's obviously not numbered, but in June 1789, and this is very early in our country's history, George Washington was only president for about a month and a half. It's only about a year after the Constitution was ratified. And his first executive order was to the heads of the federal departments at the time, which were certainly the departments of War and State, and a handful of other organizations. But again, the federal government was very small back then. And he simply directed them to, quote, impress me with a full, precise, and distinct general idea of the affairs of the United States. He's essentially asking the agency heads at the time to tell him how they're operating. What issues are they running into? Where do they need help? What can the president be doing? And that in that way, and this is true of a lot of George Washington's presidency, I think he very much, and I think historians would agree with this, he very much understood the weight of being the first American president. And as a result of that, he understood that everything he was doing sort of set the standard for what presidents after him would do. So this first executive order is him setting up essentially what we now know as the cabinet, right? That the cabinet departments meet and they tell the president what's going on and they have conversations. And in that way, you see the George Washington, again, in the very early part of the development of this country, in a single action, developing practices that to some extent we still are doing as a country today, when the president is having the cabinet meet and having executive orders and ordering the administration of government. And so during his presidency, President Washington issued about 7 orders. One that's probably the most famous of them was recognizing Thursday, November 26th as Thanksgiving. And that's ultimately was enacted into law, and we still celebrate Turkey Day every year, with the attendant traditions that we've developed as a nation over time. The remaining executive orders that George Washington passed, if you think about it, were all ways of dealing with a young country. So for example, he had an executive order that directed Americans to respect the treaties that we had entered into with several of the Native American tribes. Some of them were regarding certain types of taxation. And then also my personal favorite, because it's my home now, setting the boundaries of the District of Columbia. I don't know if many of you know this, but George Washington chose the location of the District of Washington on a peninsula that extends out between the Potomac and Anacostia rivers, which is where it's situated today. So that's an executive order I would say is near and dear to my heart, as I call the District of Columbia home these days. And we can think about, so George Washington has 7, 8 executive orders, but the number of executive orders presidents have issued over time varies greatly. One president, I believe it was William Henry Harrison, did not issue a single executive order. And then I guess I'll call it an award for the most executive orders went to FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he had 3,721 executive orders by some count. And, that's a very high number. It's certainly high by modern standards, but again, I think we can think about, why are his numbers a little bit higher than, say, modern presidents? And again, he was dealing with the Great Depression and World War II, and a lot of the ordering of the government during that time was being done by executive order. Some popular, some not. An example of an organization that was built as a product of executive orders during Roosevelt's time in office was the WPA, which is the Works Progress Administration. Those of you who have studied the New Deal in school are probably familiar with this. And the WPA built things like Camp David and the Hoover Dams, extended national parks and park facilities, including the Blue Ridge Parkway here in Virginia. They also established thousands of libraries and art centers and communities throughout the country. And so this is all something that was the byproduct of an executive order. So you can see how, as I said in the very beginning, there's ways that executive orders touch our daily lives that we don't even necessarily know. I mean, we could be driving down a highway or checking a book out of a library and not realizing that that's really something that came as a result of an executive order. There's looking at that sort of mystery number, and I would say the reason we have that mystery number is, again, not all executive orders were numbered. I think over time, what counted as an executive order and what didn't is subject to some historical debate. But if we look at the top 5 folks who, and by folks I mean presidents, who have issued executive orders, including Roosevelt, President Wilson, Coolidge, President Theodore Roosevelt, and President Truman, they count for roughly half of all executive orders issued in the history of the country. And that's sort of, to me, I'm kind of a numbers person. I find that number really interesting. But again, we're talking about between 1901, when President Theodore Roosevelt came into office, and 1952, when President Truman left office. Think about what happened in the country during that time period. Again, you're talking about World War I, World War II, you're talking about massive expansion of states, territories, the building of the Panama Canal, development of new agencies, new technologies. And so it's not necessarily unusual, if you think about it in the greater historical context, to see those numbers. It's a little jarring when you see them just written on a piece of paper, but you could see how during those time periods, as the country was growing and there was, real innovation in how we think about government and what government is and is not capable of doing, that those numbers would creep very high. By comparison, the most recent presidents, 5 presidents, Presidents Biden, Trump, Obama, Bush, and Clinton, averaged about 100, 150 per term. And in his 2 terms, President Clinton had issued 364 executive orders. That's the most out of the 5 most recent presidents. So you can see there's a great difference in you know, how things were done early on versus now. And so we think about that a lot. What you see now, and I think it's one of the critiques that you hear about the use of executive orders, is that some of them are for like basic everyday things, right? We need to have a certain statutory pay increase for federal workers that's adjusted to inflation, right? That's an executive order. The president sends that as an executive order. It's time for the annual pay increase. But you see some more complicated ones that start touching on policy. And depending on who's the president and then who gets elected after that president, you can see some back and forth between policies. And that's certainly one of the ways that executive orders are used now. They're used as a tool of policy, whether it's implementing policy or it's just trying to signal goals that the administration would like to achieve over the next 4 years or 8 years in the instance that they're reelected. But again, you know, even though there's those sort of policy ends to it, it's just really important to remember that at the end of the day, executive orders are meant as a way to permit the president to effectively manage what is a very large organization, and that's sort of the federal government. I know some of you might be thinking, well, if the president can issue them, what happens if there's like a bad one, right? One that maybe violates the Constitution or maybe Congress disagrees with. And there are ways to revoke and modify executive orders. As I mentioned before, executive orders have to be issued subject to statutory and constitutional limitations. And the courts have in the past determined whether or not an executive order is valid under the statutes that they say they're issued under or under the Constitution. And the Supreme Court has invalidated some executive orders as going too far. It's also upheld some as being within the purview of the government as being appropriate for the president to do. So it can cut both ways in the analysis. Executive orders can and are regularly modified by subsequent presidents. Sometimes that's done in a full way to revoke, which means that, for example, there were a series of executive orders that President Trump issued that when President Biden got into office, he revoked those. But you can also see modification, and this happens a lot in regards to regulations and rulemaking, which is another aspect of things that the executive branch does. And so what you see is that maybe one president says, oh, I think it's really important that when we're doing rulemaking, we should get this type of information from folks who are interested in it from regulated entities. And the next president comes along, and doesn't really matter which party he's from, says, you know what, that's a good idea, but I also think we should do something more, and we should make sure that the economics of all this makes sense. And over time, you can see where there's been modifications that essentially set up the system for how we do rulemaking to an extent, even beyond what is maybe necessarily in the statutes. And a lot of that's to the benefit of the American people. It creates a more transparent government. In regards to some of those executive orders, it puts the onus or the requirement on the government to explain why it's doing certain rulemakings and substantiate that with numerical calculations, which help people evaluate it better. So executive orders, like I said, I mean, they creep into a lot of places. They're really important. I know that some of you are probably thinking, well, what are some famous ones? Because everybody always wants to know the famous ones. And I always lead off with probably the most famous executive order is the Emancipation Proclamation by President Lincoln. And that was to declare the freedom of more than 3 million slaves throughout the Confederacy. And that was issued on January 1st, 1863, about 3 years into the Civil War. By far, that's probably the one that shaped our nation the most. But as I mentioned, the establishment of the WPA under FDR was another major well-known executive order. We also had some involving desegregation of the military after World War II, and that was signed by President Truman in 1948, which, just to note, is about 16 years before the Civil Rights Act was passed. and 16 years before school desegregation was recognized in Brown versus Board of Ed. So you can see how when I was talking earlier about sometimes there's policy goals that can be enacted. I think it's an important, at the time, it was an important signal to say, we believe the military should be desegregated. That was a signal to the rest of the United States about what at least President Truman thought our national values were or should be. And then, probably one of the more recent ones that's well known was in October of 2001, President George W. Bush created the Department of Homeland Security, or I should say, it was ultimately created by statute, but the predecessor of it, the Council of Homeland Security, was created by executive order, and it was about getting various parts of our national security community talking to each other and at the table together, which is obviously really important for all of us to make sure that we're being protected effectively. And finally, I know that some of you might be thinking, well, it's really interesting that the president can do this. Can my governor do this? And the answer is yes. Most states and their governors can issue executive orders. Again, they're limited by the state constitution, the federal constitution, and laws of that state. A good example that I use, I grew up in New Jersey along the coast. We sometimes get bad storms, and the presidents will issue an executive order, emergency declaration, say during a hurricane or a tropical depression, and that allows for the mobilization of additional emergency protection for folks. And so those are really, again, really important tools that if they're being used correctly within the confines of the statutes and constitutional authority, can be very beneficial to the American people. And with that, if there's any questions.
Well, that was fascinating and a great overview of executive orders. Thank you so much, Kara. I love George Washington's first executive order. That's just such it sounds a lot like I would imagine President Washington writing his cabinet. That was really cool. Well, Jewel and Jordan, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you and let y'all lead off here with some questions.
So thank you for your very thorough introduction to executive orders. Definitely covered a lot. So one question would be, could you kind of explain how the Constitution would set up the executive branch to, like, how it would limit the power of the executive branch to carry out the law, when you could make a claim for basically doing almost anything if you just said, well, this is what I need to do in order to carry out this law? So is it in the judicial branch that they're just thinking that it needs to be challenged, and then?
And I can give you a good example of that. I talked about how some executive orders have been challenged. And the one case that we always talk about is, and I'm going to pull up the name of it so I don't mess it up. It's called Youngstown Sheet and Tube Co. v. Sawyer. And this is back in the 50s, right? So we're in the middle of the Korean War, and there were a series of union organization efforts at steel mills. And there was a concern that if they were to unionize, there's a potential that they could go on strike. If they went on strike, we wouldn't have access to the steel that they were producing in order to both fuel our efforts in the Korean War, as well as other sort of national security concerns. So at the time, President Truman issued an executive order, and they issue this order and say, well, we're going to seize the mill. We're going to take the production into our own hands. We're going to stop you from being able to strike. And that case worked its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, we understand the authorities that you're talking about, but this one might just be too far. And that is one of the few cases in which the executive order was overturned. But as an interesting kind of fact pattern, one of the rationales for that case, or for that executive order, was what we call the Defense Production Act, which allows the federal government to go in and seize some of the means of production in the country when we're in a national security posture. Recently as this spring, President Biden invoked the Defense Production Act in addressing baby formula shortages. So, you know, to your question, yes, there's limits out there, but you can understand the impulse of presidents who very much, I think, care for their country and want to make sure people are protected and safe, that they're going to do everything that they think possible and is defensible. And sometimes it takes being challenged from the outside to stop that process from happening. So the limit, I would say the limit exists, but who gets to decide what that limit is often the courts, which also means that the executive orders need to be challenged if they're going to figure out what that limit is. Now, mind you, again, there's some executive orders that just are uncontroversial, you know, annual pay increases that are required by statute, those types of things. The creation of advisory councils to advise the president on something new and developing. I mean, so there's a whole bunch of executive orders that aren't really controversial and don't get challenged. There's some that are on the margins that some people might say, well, this is actually something Congress should be legislating.
When an executive order is enforced, is there a balloon button they use that to enforce the executive orders, or how does, since Congress doesn't directly give them money the way that Congress can, if it passes a bill, then the money's then included in order to kind of get that bill done. But for an executive order where it didn't go to Congress first, then how does that happen?
So it occurs in a couple of ways. So in your example, and I talked a little bit about how we revoke or modify executive orders. For executive orders where the basis of the executive order is a statute passed by Congress, Congress can always come back in after the fact and say, executive order number whatever does not have the force of law. They can undo it that way. The other option they have is, let's say a president says everybody who works for the federal government must wear pink on Wednesdays. And they issue an executive order. And the part of that is, well, we got to tell people how to do this. Put up signs or whatever in the federal government buildings. And Congress could say, you know what, agencies, you get your budgets for the year, but no money can be made into signs to tell people to wear pink on Wednesdays. So that's another way Congress can control what is being done with executive orders.
So does every executive order go to the Supreme Court to be, when someone takes a problem with it, that they review it?
No. So, you know, when you have some of the more controversial executive orders, what ends up happening is somebody whose rights are affected by it will seek counsel and they'll file typically an action in a district court. And then depending on the outcome of that, they'll go up to the appellate court. And then finally, they may be one of the lucky very few. And I think this statistic is something like the Supreme Court takes less than 4% of cases presented to it. So if you challenge, there's no guarantee that it's ultimately going to get ruled on by, you know, the Supreme Court. It's a very rare thing. And, you know, I see this in my practice all the time. The Supreme Court is interesting in that it is a court of it gets to choose what cases it takes. If you're in district court, you just walk into district court and you file a case, and then you can appeal it to the appellate court, and those courts have to hear it. The Supreme Court chooses what it wants to hear. So usually if you see it maybe interested in a case about an executive order, it's interested in those issues, either the underlying issue or maybe specifically what are the powers at play there.
Okay, I remembered how I wanted to word the question, which was that we have on the show often talked about certain parts that are under the executive branch, like the EPA, which, yeah, so we've talked about certain parts of the government like EPA, Department of Education, you name it. So those are technically executive branch, I think we've talked about in the past. Were those administrations created by executive order? And when the federal budget comes out, is that another area where Congress kind of has to rubber stamp after the president can create the EPA, but the funding still comes from Congress?
So most of the executive agencies that you talked about are enacted by Congress. And what we call that is an organic statute, which Congress says, we identified this issue and we create this agency and they're going to administer these things. That's not to say that there aren't agencies. Like I said, the idea for Homeland Security came from executive order. There's another agency called FEMA, which is actually, I believe, now part of Homeland Security, and that's our Federal Emergency Management Agency. And those are the folks that go out for disaster relief. And they were a creature of executive order for a very long time until they were made a little bit more formal. So there's some smaller agencies that do exist out there that are strictly the creation of an executive order, but the big ones we think of on a day-to-day basis, EPA, education, Department of State, those types of things have some sort of either constitutional basis or they have an organic statute that creates them and delineates what their power is.
Okay.
But to your point is, getting back to the executive orders, is the president can say to an agency, I want you to go through all your regulations and make sure that they're still valid, right? And so if they did that, then the agency is under that executive order, has to go back, say, do these still make sense in 2022? And Congress could step in and say, hey, no, we like everything. We like all the regulations that are on the books. We don't want to touch anything. And we're not going to give you any money to go and do this review, even though there's an executive order. So that's the way, again, in like a separations of power, we see the government, the different bodies or parts of the government butting up against each other and creating checks, right? That's the checks and balances that we always talk about.
Then my last one before Jordan would be that, do you think that number one, do presidents act primarily through executive orders, or do they act without them as well? And I think I know the answer, but can you say it in the correct terms? And then also, do you think that it's through executive orders that we see the greatest destabilization or challenge to the balance of powers, or in other actions of the executive branch and the president?
So I think both those are very good questions. And so I think that one of the modern critiques of the use of executive orders is that they're doing things that are quasi-legislative, right? They're starting to do things that really only Congress can do. And maybe they're couched in language or discussed in ways that suggests it's executive and it's under the confines of a statute. But when you look at it at the end of the day, it starts looking at like something more like a statute. Congress should have done it. So that's certainly one of the critiques about modern use of executive orders. They're going too far, they're too broad, they're done without authority. I do think from what you're saying is I would consider that a destabilization of the separation of powers. I think that a lot of people, both attorneys and academics who spend a lot of time, and even historians who look at this issue, there's folks who look at this from every angle of different views. Certainly one of my views is that Congress writes the rules, the president, executes and enforces those rules, and the courts say what the law is. That very clear separation of power. And there are times when executive orders sort of reach into the congressional power and take it, and that's a problem. I think that that's a destabilization effort. And you do see that, sometimes what you hear folks say, and this is all sides, all parties, all recent presidents, they do this because it's easier. And I don't come from the school of thought that just because something's easy is how we should be doing it. The Constitution sets up a particular set of rules that we're supposed to follow, and that's how it should be done. So those are excellent questions.
Well, I'll just ask one quick one because I know we're running short on time. Do you think that the modernism of America has called for more executive orders to be passed, or is it just kind of a quick way for the president to more or less get what he wants?
Also a good question. I think you can look at it a couple of ways, because like I talked about earlier, you look at the glut of executive orders that were issued between, like I said, 1901 to about 1949, 1954. And a lot of that, I think, was what was then a result of modernization. Even something as simple as the creation of the typewriter meant people could put out more information. You could write regulations faster. These sorts of things that we don't necessarily think about as creating more and bigger government in terms of efficiency. So I think one of the reasons we see fewer executive orders now is that some of those early things are already in. We're using computers. We can do this a lot faster. But I do think that you do see an overuse, and I think that this is not unique to any one president or political party, of if I can't get Congress to do what I want, then I'll just pick up the phone or I'll write an executive order and I'll just get it done. And I think that, there are recently, at least, I'm thinking, and when I say recent, I always think in terms of like the last 5 presidents. So since about 1996, 94, in my lifetime, I should say, that there is that sort of, I think, pressure on presidents to just act, right? They're the executive, they're the CEO, I'm just going to act. And I can understand that impulse, but again, I think that there's an order to how this should occur. It's set forth in the Constitution, and presidents swear an oath to uphold the Constitution. I think that in doing things like executive orders, I think that there should be a little bit more, I guess, not humble is the word, but I think that they should be a little bit more careful about what they're actually issuing and how it's going to impact folks.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to pass it on to our next panelist.
All right, thank you so much. This was very informative, and I was honestly very invested the entire time. I know I'm probably going to answer my grandmother's question first because she's listening and she had a question. She said,
Hi, Grandma.
She does it all the time. If executive orders often get ratified into law, do they really take away constitutional authority?
So if they're ratified in law, which means, and if I'm understanding Grandma's question correctly, means that Congress essentially adopts them after the fact, then I think those concerns about constitutional power and what is or is not being taken are reduced once Congress does it. Now, there's sort of the flip side of that question is, well, if Congress feels the need to ratify something the president has already done, is there an open question about whether or not the president was doing that with the appropriate and necessary amount of authority? And so that's a really interesting question. I think I can't think of like an example of where that happened, but certainly in some cases, ratification could fix certain types of constitutional injuries.
Let's like get my notes organized. So it said thus far that President Biden has issued 34 executive orders, whereas former President Trump issued 15. How is the overabuse of executive orders a serious threat to our constitutional freedoms?
So I think, there's a couple ways of looking at it. You can look at it in terms of raw numbers. And that's like an easy way to compare and say, oh, well, and I have some of the numbers in front of me. President George W. Bush issued 291 and President Bill Clinton issued 364. And you can draw, distinctions between that. I think one of the bigger issues is that you have to actually look at the core context of what the executive orders are doing. If I issue 500 executive orders saying, lower the flag in honor of an American hero, the amount of impact that has is very different than if I'm the president, I have 5 executive orders that, redo the way we administer agency action. And so I think it's hard to do a direct comparison as a result of that. You'd have to really dig in and see what the orders are doing and how the agencies then go and implement them.
And do our government agencies have too much power since they are not elected and are not responsible to the citizens?
That's certainly one of the critiques that comes up pretty often. And I think the way you can think about it, and President Woodrow Wilson came from a school of thought regarding the idea of the importance of federal administration, and we kind of know as bureaucracy. And the idea being these agencies are experts in what they do, and they enforce and interpret really technical policy. And it's very important to have scientific experts and folks that really understand it. And who are we to question the experts? I mean, it's sort of a very loose explanation of that, like what we call the Wilsonian sort of view of government. And there's folks on the other side who say that's all well and good. I mean, certainly, I don't want somebody who's not a nuclear physicist or engineer determining America's nuclear power policy, right? We don't want, small mom and pop nuclear reactors, not a great idea. But at the same time, there's entire aspects of agencies and when they do regulations and enforcement, where are they really acting in any sort of expert capacity? This is something I handle in the work I do, dealing with what we call administrative law judges, and they handle enforcement in the agencies. And, there's a question that's being litigated right now. It's going up to the Supreme Court in the fall that sort of touches on the ideas. Is an administrative law judge a special type of judge who is employed by an agency? Can they answer constitutional law questions? Or is that something that only an Article 3 judge can do? I'd say only an Article 3 judge can do that. But certainly there are folks who say, no, these administrative law judges are experts in their agency and they can do these types of adjudications and it's really efficient. So those are sort of probably the two extremes on the schools of thought, and there's everything in between on that. But I do think that it's an ongoing conversation about what administrative power looks like.
And then how does Congress fight executive orders, and how often do executive orders get overturned by the courts?
The answer to both of those is rarely. It's very rare, and I don't have any raw statistics. I wasn't able to find it about how many executive orders have been overturned or modified by Congress. But as I talked about before, a couple ways they can do that is they can pass a statute saying executive order 10 billion does not have the force of law, or they could say no money in this budget will be given to help implement executive order 10 billion. And so that's one way Congress gets its oversight. And again, the courts also get the opportunity to review if it's brought before them. Those are a little bit, I would say, those are also rare. They tend to be a little bit less successful, I think, on the whole, if you look at it statistically. But again, as if we look at sort of the decrease in the use of executive orders in terms of raw numbers, but the increase in impact and what they're doing, that might change in the near future in terms of presidents maybe stepping outside of those statutory and constitutional constraints that are put on them.
Okay. Then on the topic of constraints, what constrains the executive orders to remain constitutional?
The fear of the courts, I suppose. And I think that we can have differing opinions on sort of the policies or the policy goals that different executive orders are trying to implement. I would like to say, at least it's my view, that I think that at the end of the day, we're fortunate in this country that our presidents generally are working on behalf of the American people, and they are doing what they think is best for the country. And you'd hope that being guided by at least that impulse would mean that we would have things that are being done within the confines of statutes and constitutions. And, when they step outside of that, that's when attorneys like myself come into play and start engaging the courts in, hey, you need to be a referee on this. We think it's gone too far.
And I think my final question, because I saw we're getting very, very low on time. How can executive orders be reversed? Is it through the Supreme Court or through the next president?
It's a little bit of everything. Like I said, Congress has the power through some of their checks and balances. Courts can overturn them. And future presidents can rescind or revoke them or modify them in some way. So it really sort of depends on what's going on.
Oh. Well, thank you so much. I really
You're
appreciate
welcome.
you being able to come on here.
Well, and thank you, Haley, for being on with us today, and great questions. And thank you, Jewel and Jorn. We've got some audience questions too, Kara. Professor Klinger, first of all, asks, is there a difference, or what is the difference between executive orders, presidential memoranda, and presidential proclamations?
So there's not a, I guess, definitional distinction. A lot of these documents do get lumped together, and I think that creates some confusion. Generally, a good way to look at it is that executive orders are directives and mandates to the executive branch on how to administer the law, how to be managed, how to organize. They have the full force and effect of law. Proclamations, by contrast, which are also signed, they have a consecutive numbering system like executive orders do, tend to affect less the government and more private individuals. So you'll see it's National Ice Cream Day. That's usually a proclamation. But other examples of proclamations, I think that have a little bit more weight to them, or I should say the outcome was a little bit more heavy, was, for example, President Theodore Roosevelt declared the first national monument, Devil's Tower in Wyoming, by proclamation. And then also the pardon of President Nixon was done by proclamation. And so, those are things that sort of touch on legal rights and abilities, but not necessarily all proclamations have the full force of an effect of law, depending on their subject matter. And the last are administrative orders, executive memoranda, notices, messages, these sorts of communications and policy type things. They may be signed, but they're usually not numbered. They're published in the Federal Register in many instances, but they typically don't have the full force of law behind them. And that means that they can't be, an agency can't come to me and say, look, there's this presidential memo and you're supposed to do X, Y, and Z, or we're going to bring a lawsuit against you. That's sort of the difference between whether or not something has the full force and effect of law, at least in a very easy to digest way to explain it.
Thank you. And Richard MacArthur asks, are the departmental regulations executive orders, or is the term executive order reserved for those issued by the overall head of the executive branch?
So executive orders are strictly reserved for the president. Like regulations issued by departments, they have the full force and effect of law. What's interesting is an executive order, because of what it's doing, can actually be the source or one of the reasons why an agency issues a regulation. So they're sort of on equal footing to an extent, but an executive order can be to say to an agency, go issue regulations that, do X, Y, Z.
That's a great clarification. And last week, we talked a lot about departmental regulations and rulemaking and the whole rulemaking process. So if you missed that one, you can go to our archives and watch it. It was really fascinating as well. Now, let's see, Professor Klinger also asks, the Mexico City policy was done by presidential memorandum. Why was that not an executive order? And I mean, you may not know, but I just thought it was an interesting question.
No, I'm not familiar with that policy.
Okay. And then let's see, what else do we have? Martha Jenkins asked, I know we asked about how often executive orders are turned, or basically, I guess, to have how often Congress rules or I guess overturns an executive order. But Martha asks, how many executive orders have been ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court? Or do we have any examples of that?
The Youngstown case I mentioned, and I do not know the exact number, but I think at some point I had read it's less than 10 have been ruled, executive orders that have been ruled unconstitutional on the merits by the full court. So like I said, they're sort of rare, but as executive orders get used more for more substantive as opposed to sort of the traditional, shuffling of paperwork, we might see that number change in the future.
Okay. We also have a couple of questions about the War Powers Act. Peter Schleicher asks, is this a reason the War Powers Act was made into law? Did presidents take too much power in involving the country in war? And then Sandy Thatcher asked, along the same lines, would you please comment on how often executive orders are used to declare war? And he mentions there's a book that he was involved in publishing at Penn State Press that investigated this issue.
I'm not really outside of the fact that I know that they're used to reorder, say, military objectives or personnel type things. I'm not really familiar with the use in the national security context, particularly in declarations of war.
Okay. And then Gary Porter says, is there a constitutional clause which specifically gives Congress the authority to delegate its legislative power to the president or executive branch agencies?
So we talk about this in terms of the non-delegation doctrine, and it stems from the concept of separation of powers itself, right? If you look at the Article 1, it says all legislative power. And that means that anything is legislative. The only way the other branches can be doing it is if Congress has somehow given them that power. And that's the way we think about it. We always think about separation of powers in terms of who has what power and what power are they expressing in a given action, and is it the power that they're allowed to under the Constitution or has been given to them in some other way.
Great. Well, we are right at the top of the hour, and we just thank you so much for being with us. It was a fascinating hour and such an important topic. And I want to thank all of our audience members for being with us today. And we did something fun last week. I want to ask the audience again, if you have watched all of these so far, either live or via archives, our 5 episodes on Countdown to Constitution Day, raise your hand. Do y'all know how to do that? You raise your hand, and there we go. We've got Karen Sue Hisley and Tara Zelenock and Geraldine Duveau, Mary Margaret Boleto, Robert Spiegler, William Kranger. Oh my goodness, William Clark, Rita Malamund, Cami Wanas. And I know my dad, Don Hay, has watched everyone. His hand is not raised, but Dad, I know you've been on. So let's see, I think I said William Kramer. So remember, all of you that watch all of them, whether you watch them live or you watch them on our archives, at the end of this series, we're going to send you a certificate of constitutional knowledge for participating in all of our Countdown to Constitution Day episodes. So we want to thank you all for being with us. And Jewel and Jorn and Haley, would y'all like to make any parting comments?
Yeah, thanks for a great show. It's cool to hear it all from Laura's perspective, and everybody come back next week.
And I know I joined last minute, but it was really good. I'm very glad I was able to make it on. And thank you so much for joining us all.
Well, and thank you again to our guest, Kara Rollins. Kara, we just appreciate all you do. And we put the link to the new Civil Liberties Alliance in our Q&A. We encourage everybody to check out your organization. You're doing a great job of helping, I guess, ensure our freedoms against overzealous government regulations. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. This was great. And y'all had wonderful questions. So thank you so much.
Well, thank y'all. Y'all have a great week. Bye-bye.